Okay, big question. Why am I doing this? We all ask ourselves that question every so often. Why am I doing this? And it can be related to any or every activity, from our health activities to our vocation, to our finances, to our faith. Why am I doing this? And we ask the question why as we need to remember and we need to reevaluate what we're doing. We need to remember the vision of why we started in the first place. And does that vision still energize your heart? Does it still excite your mind? Because where there is vision and there is passion together, there will be action. That's just the way we work. When we have a vision for something and a passion for something, we put our boots to the ground and we do something about it. And we can see that evidenced in all the different things that we find ourselves involved in right now. We're involved in them because there's some sort of vision and passion. And where there is good vision and some right action, we get good outcomes. And of course, the converse can be true. If we actually don't think about the vision we're following and we're not careful about our actions, we can actually get some very poor outcomes. So this necessitates that we evaluate, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? So we ask questions like, is it good what I'm doing? Is it worth it what I'm doing and what I'm investing myself into? Is it wise what I'm doing? And even am I doing it right? Is it taking me where I want to need to go, or do I need to do some sort of course correction or something? So we need to reevaluate to help us learn where we need to change, if we need to change. For example, we might find that, my financial actions aren't giving me the savings that I need. So I need to make a course correction. Or we might find my health habits, they're actually keeping me fit and capable of doing things. So I just need to continue doing those things because it's working. And I got to stay the course so that it can continue working. So asking the question, why am I doing this, can be really helpful. Give us some really good evaluation to make sure that we're either on course or we can correct to be back on course. Well, as we engage in this discipleship series here, someone recently posed a question here because they were conversing with a new believer, and the question came up because they actually came to church and just kind of I've never experienced something like this before. Why do you do that? And the question is, why do we worship? And it's a great question. This individual doesn't understand why we do various practices of worship, because the thought and the practice of worship is just totally foreign to them, and they didn't know. So why do we worship? Is it just like some form of Christian karaoke? Where you go to the pub and there's all the words on the screen, little bouncing ball and stuff like that. We have those. Is that what we're doing? Is that what this is about? Is it just for, entertainment or some sort of social or emotional experience? Why do we do this? Well, the scriptures in Christian history have a lot to say about worship and why we do this and why it's good for us. There's so much in there. So much about worship in here that we're not even going to come close to covering everything that could be said here. So we're just going to look at a few key points that I think are really important for us and important for this moment, particularly as we speak to people who are newer in faith. So we're gonna approach what the scriptures in history have to say. By first asking this question, well, what is worship? If we look in the scriptures for just the most basic framework for what worship is, what will we find? And what we'll find repeatedly is this, is that worship is a response to God. Worship is a response to God's self-revelation, his self-disclosure. Worship is our response to God's love for us. When God shows his mercy towards us, when God shows his kindness and generosity towards us, his healing, and even when he saves us. And salvation is not just for eternity, but for everything that ails us from now until eternity. So our worship is a response to God. I mean, think of it this way. When a friend or even a stranger comes to your aid, helps you out, saves your bacon, so to speak, and they do so with an act of mercy and generosity, what do? We respond to them. We respond to them with gratitude, with praise. Thank you for helping me, Rochelle. You saved my bacon. Thank you. We extend that kind of gratitude. And often we even desire to give something in return. I am so grateful. Is there something I can do for you? That's kind of the response that happens quite naturally for us. I remember this one time, Karis and I were traveling for our 20th wedding anniversary, and we went somewhere nice. We went to the island of Barbados, and so being consummate explorers, we end up driving into the middle of nowhere, and while we're driving on these roads with all these potholes, and they're really thin, and it's kind of dodgy, pop! Our tire blows. It's like, oh no, I don't want to pay for this in the rental car. And it's just like, this is the worst thing ever. And we're in the middle of nowhere, and there's just kind of way off in the distance, there's this really, really shabby bar. And anyways, we're just kind of sitting there. I get out of the car and just look around. I was like, oh no, well, here we go. I don't even know if this car has a jack or anything. But then these two dudes come out of the bar and they start walking towards us, and both of them have these big reefers hanging out of their mouth. And I'm thinking, it's like, oh, this might not go well. But am I about to get mugged or something? Like, what's going on? And anyways, these guys are like, hey, buddy, don't worry about it. We're going to change your tire. It's like, what? It's like, I don't know, this seems really, no. We want to change your tire. We want to make sure that, you're a guest on our island. We want to make sure that you're really well taken care of for, that you have a great time on this island, and that there's no problems. It's like, oh, okay. So, it's like, pop open the trunk, and these guys, it's like, oh, well, here, let me help you. No, I don't want you to get your hands dirty. And so for the next 5 minutes, these two guys, they changed the tire, they put the spare on, they put the other one, just boom, boom, like that. And it's like, whoa, wow, that's so kind, thank you. And I just, I pour out, just my gratitude, thank you for doing that, for one. And because we were going somewhere, I was like, I didn't even have to get my hands dirty, wow. Thank you. It's like, can I do something for you? Can I give you $5 or something? I don't know. And they're just like, no. We don't even want that. We just want to, show kindness as a hospitality of our island. It's like, wow, thank you. And my gratitude is such that I'm still telling that story, which is kind of, an illustration of life and of faith. When you encounter something that's just really kind like that, the gratitude, it lingers, and you continue to tell the story. It continues to have an effect on me. That was over 7 years ago, and it still has an effect on me. It still brightens me up when I tell that story. So our worship is our response to all that God has done for us and all that God has revealed to us. So we worship or attribute worthship, because that English word worship comes from worthship. We attribute worship or worship to God because God is worthy. Why do we worship? God is worthy. All of the things that he has done for us, who he is, all of it. God is worthy. We read in 1 John chapter 4, we love God because he first loved us. There's no way that we can do this on our own. Our worship can only ever be a response, never something we can muster up on our own. We take what he's given given to us and what we've received, and all we can do is offer some of it back. That's it. Our worship is a response. And next, we see too in the scriptures that the response of worship is relational. I mean, when we think about how we respond to other people and their kindness, we do so how? Relationally. With however that gratitude unfolds, usually verbally in terms of the things that we say, and sometimes even physically with like handshakes or hugs or something like that. And our response, it is relational. There's a connection that is made and that is often established. And, kind of on the other side of things is that when the response becomes merely transactional and not relational to something, like we notice that the response is just so empty and lifeless or even denigrated. Like when, for example, if you ever do something for somebody and then, there's zero gratitude and the guy, here's $5. It's just like, I don't want your money. It's just like, but there's no gratitude there. It's like it's almost cheapened by trying to make it transactional. It really denigrates something because the response is meant to be relational. We are a relational people. So our response of worship is relational. It's how God created us. And the good news is that this relationship is a two-way street, and it is a reciprocal interaction. Is that we respond to God, and then God responds to us, and we respond to God, and God responds to us. And it's this self-perpetuating, life-giving cycle of responding to one another in ongoing relationship. Thus, we can have an encounter with God in worship. We can experience his intimate presence. We can experience his peace, his comfort, his healing. We can experience his encouragement, his revelation, his empowering grace. And we see numerous examples of this in the scriptures, in the Old and in the New Testament, where God responds in various ways to the worship of his people. A couple of my favorite examples are like in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 and 7. Where they're dedicating the temple and the priests start doing their thing, and all of a sudden the presence of God comes and responds to the worship of the people, and a thick cloud fills the place. And in both of these passages said the presence of God is so thick that the priests can't even do their job anymore. Like nobody can do anything other than just to enjoy the cloud of glory, the presence of God that is so strong and so thick there, revealing himself, encouraging them, and building them up that way. So our worship in so many regards becomes interactive. Now, of course, there's this element here, about how and when God chooses to respond. It's both a mystery and it's purely an act of grace. There's nothing we can do to kind of coax or manipulate this, and we definitely shouldn't even try. That's kind of the trap that all the idolaters got into, trying to appeal to and appease their various gods. Like, the true God doesn't work that way. He does what he does, and it's all an act of grace. And we can just receive it or not. Now, we could almost end this message here because encountering God's presence and interacting in loving and reciprocal relationship is a wonderful end in and of itself. It's one of the reasons why we worship, to encounter him, to be with him, and to interact with him, and to receive all the goodness that he has for us. But as we examine the scriptures, we find there's more. And here's where I want to land when discussing an important reason why we worship. And there's many more reasons, but I just want to focus in on one for the rest of our time today. So we're going to take a brief look at Romans chapter 12 here, verses 1 and 2, where we read, the Apostle Paul writes, "In view of God's mercy," and now here's the response, "offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to discern what is the perfect will of God." Now, when Paul says our spiritual worship, what he's doing is he's including offering our bodies as living sacrifices here. So what that really means is that it's not just a matter of believing the right thoughts or of just kind of surrendering our hearts, but our response of worship actually has a physicality to it. There's tangible actions related to our response of worship. And as we look a little bit further down in the passage in Romans chapter 12, like through verses 9 through 18, I'm not going to go through all of this. We looked at this last week in part of our speaking time there, but you can see just what it looks like to worship God, how we act out in love towards one another and towards all the world around us. So going back to the first couple of verses here in Romans 12, notice here that our response of worship has three vital benefits here. One is that we're not being conformed to the patterns of this world when we worship. Two, we're being transformed while we worship by the renewing of our mind. And then three, we become able to discern the will of God. So, how does that happen? Like that's really amazing. That's an amazing benefit here. Well, not being conformed to the patterns of this world means that we live according to another pattern. And living according to that other pattern, the way of Jesus, living according to that other pattern, it will change us. It will transform us from the inside out, from the outside in. Having minds and hearts transformed by the way of Jesus will actually then make us able to discern the will of God. So we've seen that worship is relational, and we've seen that worship is a response of embodied action. But the thing that I really want to land on here is that worship is about our spiritual formation. Worship is about becoming like Jesus. This is one of the reasons why we worship, because worship changes us. It's the way God designed it. Becoming like Jesus is the goal of Christian life. I mean, just very quickly, like in Galatians 4:19, we read Paul saying, that he's labored until Christ is formed within you. Or Colossians 1:28, that all of the things that all the believers and the apostles has done so that we might present everyone fully mature in Christ. Becoming like Jesus is the goal of the Christian life. And in the Old Testament, we even see this. Even before Jesus came, we see this same pattern still, where there's this principle within worship that overgirds all Old Testament worship, and that is this: you become what you behold. What you worship will change you. You become what you behold. It's one of the primary reasons for both the worship of God, especially as it was mandated then and as it was directed so carefully. It's one of the primary reasons for both the worship of God and also the avoidance of idolatry. Like, you can't mess around with the idols. Why? Because it will change you, and it will change you in a not good way. This isn't a place where we can play the fence here. It has to be all or nothing on one side or the other. Because what you behold, you will become. And that makes our worship of God really important. Another way of stating this, and I'm going to borrow here from my friend Dr. Dan Wilt, who I studied under many, many years ago. What you do creates what you believe. The embodied actions that you repeatedly participate in will create what you believe. And that's why it's really good to carefully think about everything that you do and every habit that you have, because it will create your beliefs and it will set the trajectory for your life. What you do creates what you believe. Our outward actions feed our inward beliefs, and our inward beliefs then can help to spur on our actions, which then spur on more belief, and it can become, again, this self-perpetuating, self-feeding cycle. And if we're wise, this can work out really well in our benefit. when we have lives that are saturated in worship, it's going to really strengthen our inward beliefs, and then it'll further strengthen the outward actions that we have towards everyone around us. Now, speaking of my friend, Dr. Dan Will, I'm going to quote and paraphrase something that he wrote this week. It's just kind of interesting that what he wrote fits so well with what I wanted to speak on. So I'm just gonna steal the words of my friend here, just because it works so well here. So, quoting Dan here, Dan said, "When I first became a Christian in high school, I thought being a follower of Jesus was all about what I believed. I think that those who were discipling thought that this was the way it worked as well. What I did, at most, was apparently what came naturally, but modified my beliefs. In the early centuries of the church, it didn't quite work this way. Growing and blossoming in the midst of pagan culture, people were being trained to be like Jesus. They had to lose the old ways, but by replacing them with new ways. Jesus and then Paul taught that they had Christ in them. So the Spirit was bringing Jesus out in them. But they knew that outward action would shape inward belief. Christ-likeness grew from the inside out and the outside in. The Spirit of Jesus in them was helping them to let go, to surrender, to let Him take the lead in their formation. But then they participated in that transformation. Their habitus, a neat little Latin word there, their habitus, which is their series of dispositions and bodily responses to the world, was being retrained to become a Christian habitus instead of a pagan one. And habitus comes from that word habit, just in case that isn't clear. So to think, to feel, and to act like Jesus by new first instinct was the goal. Mentoring, worship practices, and observation were all a part of this process. Love for Jesus and one another bound it all together in one community learning system rooted in worship practices. Alan Kreider, in his book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, noted the following ways a Christian habits, was formed in community in these centuries. Many of the items on this list describe worship as a primary place of formation. Now check this out. The activities of the early church in forming people in the way of Christ. Meeting frequently. Standing in prayer with arms raised. Praising and thanking God. Making the sign of the cross. Eating together. Giving the kiss of peace. Memorizing scriptural texts. Visiting the poor, the sick, and the prisoners. Exercising hospitality. Putting money in the collection box. Replenishing the stocks of food and clothing. Feeding needy people. Discerning carefully. Being truthful. Maintaining sexual purity. Observing disciplines that limit impatient behavior. Being willing to lose out. Allowing people to leave the church. Facing death without fear. A survey of centuries of early Christians, and these were practices that were very commonly involved in their formation. So Dan continues, so like you, I want to become like Jesus. It will take a lifetime, but I'm in. He is in me, and my union with him will bring my goal to fruition. Yet, there are practices in my life that will help me become more like him in this world. Okay, now let's bring all this back. And even just for the sake of this morning, just kind of narrow in on the worship practices of the church. And just, all that we do as the church in the 21st century, all that we do, just like Kreider's list of common early church practices, all that we do in our worship serves to form us in Christ-likeness. That's why. Even just in the limited context of this morning, in this one little church, think of all that we've already done to form us in Christ Jesus, like the reading of the scripture, following the lectionary pattern, continuing on in yearly cycles to remembering the story of God. We're forming our minds and our hearts with truth, with wisdom, with the perspective of the Lord. And we're placing ourselves within the great story of God rather than having the world tell us another story. The songs that we sing as we respond to the Lord in worship. Why do we sing? Why is the church sung for all these centuries? It's because singing is something that we can all do together. There are few, if any, other human activities that are more communal than singing together. If you can think of one, eating together might be one, but if you can think of more activities like that, let me know. But singing is one of the most communal human activities that we can do together. And when we sing, we get to sing truth into one another's hearts and minds. We sing faith into one another's hearts and minds. And at times, too, we even hear our own voice speaking to ourselves and able even to speak faith into our own person. Kind of like Psalm 104, bless the Lord, O my soul. Who's he speaking to? Himself. Bless the Lord, O my soul. When we gather around the communion table here, what are we doing? Many things, but we're learning to practice the invitational heart of Jesus, the invitational posture of Jesus. We're learning hospitality from Christ himself as we come together. So many different people from different places coming around the table together as one family. And we practice the remembrance of self-giving love and sacrifice as we gather around the table every week. What a beautiful thing to be formed in, yeah? And, lastly, when we pray for one another, as we will at the end of this service, we do so as Jesus modeled. We enter into this place of prayer, aligning ourselves to the will of the Father, looking for what the Father is doing, seeking to come beside him, behind him, beside him, and bless it. And again, living in this self-giving love where we step out of this place that might even be uncomfortable to approach another person and take some risks and pray and bless them in the name of the Lord and see what would happen. Okay. So, this is why we worship. Why do we continue to worship every Sunday with all these ongoing habits, these similar habits on and on, over and over? I can't remember which scholar said it, but it's a quote that's stuck with me for a couple decades now. And that's this, that a key indicator that we are a broken race is that we forget. Regular worship is necessary for our remembrance. And remembrance is necessary for maintaining strength and for actually being able to achieve growth. Now, worship in the Old Testament in particular, you can see, is contained in these calendared cycles. Why is that? To help them remember who God is, to help them remember who they are, and to help them to continually see the story that they're in. So that it'll be a light to their feet and a guide to their pathway. And whenever they stopped the ongoing cycle, what happened? Things actually, they fell right apart. And it didn't take long for the wheels to fall right off the bus. Repeatedly rehearsing their story sustained how they lived among the nations. But when they stopped worshiping God, their behavior became horribly oppressive, which is why you look in the prophetic books of the Old Testament and God's laying down all these indictments. And at the root of all those indictments, you stopped worshiping, and this is what happened. And then when the people, when they would return to him, as is the main call in those books, return to me. When they would return to him and they would worship again, what would happen? They would begin to act justly, to act rightly, and then peace would come to the land. Imagine that. Until they started the cycle again, started worshiping idols, became like their idols, slipped into destruction again. But when they would return to him and worship and begin those ongoing practices, things went well. When I think of this, I think, just like playing music here, it takes practice to become a musician. It takes practice to become a musician, and it takes constant practice to stay a musician. And if you do that for a lifetime of consistent practice, you can actually become a real craftsman when you pick up the instrument and you start singing, and it actually is pleasant to listen to. And we could say the same thing for sports, or for academics, or for business, or for hospitality. Any of these things, if you constantly seek yourself into and just continue to practice, you will do really, really well. And when you stop, what happens? Your abilities recede into decay. Stop practicing, your music isn't going to sound all that good anymore. You stop studying, your academics aren't going to be good anymore. Stop applying yourself to your business. Every area of life, the same principle works. And this is why ongoing worship is so important for all of us. And I'm going to end with this quote here that I found a couple months ago from my friend Dr. Beth Stovell down in Calgary, whom we might meet on October 18th, 19th during our event. But she writes that the minor prophets repeatedly draw a connection between justice and worship. Our relationship with God affects how we treat others. Again, we have this reminder from the scriptures that our worship is so important for us and for the entire world around us. And so it is good to continue to meet the Lord in worship because it changes our lives. Our worship plays a major role in our becoming like Jesus. When we worship, we are changed. It is a received grace of God that we are changed. And at the same time, God gives us a part to participate in this grace. The call of God to each of us is toward Christ, to be changed by Christ and to become like Christ. And now the big question for us is, how am I going to respond to his invitation? What am I willing to invest? How often am I willing to invest? How am I willing to invest? In what ways will I choose to be intentional about worship and about my own formation? For my own good and for the good of the entire world around me. For our good as a church and for the good of the entire world around us, where we are to be a light reflecting our good and loving God. When we choose to worship, we choose to be changed, and it is good.